living vicariously through somebody else. I would say that's for me at least. So I wouldn't say necessarily I don't know if I don't think like I necessarily get scared because I like horror stuff and movies and stuff. So I don't know. Like I don't really get spooked or anything. But I guess like there are certain things that I guess like yeah, I guess if I had to say yes or no to your question, I'd probably say probably yeah. Um I don't really want to say what topics to be honest. So I would say yeah, but I wouldn't say which topics would probably spook me the most. But yeah. Sometimes I would say sometimes, not all the time. But yeah. Sometimes I kind of pick them on purpose, but normally I would say no.
Any old Sunday. It was Remembrance Sunday. Remembrance Sunday in the UK is basically like Veterans Day in the US, a day to remember our war dead and pay our respects to them. A lot of people choose to stop and stand still at 11 a.m., the same time that the guns fell silent in World War I, and have a minute's silence. And a lot of people get together at places like cathedrals or army places, streets, and say prayers and stuff like that.
What about
Some
you?
churches have a drink after the services too. Nothing too wild, just a pint or two with old mates in memory of the fallen. But that means people needed taxis, so it was an ideal time for Dave to hop in his cab and go looking for fares. Now, from about 10 o'clock onwards, David started getting jobs ferrying people around the city to various church services. But he also got jobs taking one or two groups to the cathedral, which is where this big Remembrance Day ceremony was being.
You know what? Just to save on time, I'm gonna switch to the Appalachian Mountains.
Growing up in Portland, Maine, I always looked up to my big brother Tommy. He was funny, he was brave, and he was by far the best player on his high school football team.
Like I said,
He was
was so
so
you
good
already know what
that his
happened.
coaches were talking about scholarships by the time his senior year rolled around. But Tommy had other plans, and in 1964, he took a bullet flying a helicopter over in Vietnam. And in typical Tommy fashion, he managed to fly his bird back to base, and he even landed the thing before passing out. Doctors fought to save his life, but sadly, he didn't make it through the surgery, and we lost him. I was 13 when we got the news, and it broke us. It was the worst that ever happened to us, and it took 5 long years before we even felt like a family again. But then, just as we were starting to shake off the grief and regain some sense of normalcy, the draft happened. I was
Oh,
18,
brother.
unemployed, and ripe to be picked out for mandatory military service, and when my parents realized this, they freaked. Mom almost lost her mind thinking that she might lose a second son to the same godforsaken war, and Dad wasn't much better. But unlike Tommy, who wanted to go to Vietnam because he wanted to fly helicopters on Uncle Sam's dime, I had a way out. An old friend of my mom's had a brother in the church, and if he pulled a few strings, he could get me a scholarship for an undergrad course at the University of Maine. And because if I was destined for the seminary, I could dodge the draft and avoid Vietnam altogether. And the plan was for me to skip out once the draft ended. But to my surprise, studying the Bible gave me back a sort of hope that losing Tommy had taken away. Faith proved a potent medicine, so when it came time to leave, I decided to stick around instead. Now, for me, the church was all about service, not just God, but to my fellow man, and so I relished any and all opportunities to volunteer with charitable organizations. Naturally, I preferred to work in places which needed that charity most, and this was how I became involved in the Schoolhouse Project. It was started in the late 70s by the Maine Council of Churches as a means of providing Sunday school services to kids in underprivileged areas. They had a chapter down in Florida, one in Oklahoma, and another in Arkansas, but they wanted to open a fourth chapter in the state of Virginia, and they wanted me to spearhead it. I considered it a great honor, so I accepted the offer on the spot. Then in the late spring
Fucking
1977,
fly.
I was headed down to where Kentucky meets the two Virginias to start up my Sunday
Two
school.
Virginias.
Now, here's where some of you are going to take issue with the way that I tell the story, and for that, I'm just going to apologize in advance. But I once promised a man that, should I ever formally retell it, I'd protect the identities of the innocent to preserve what little peace God's allowed them in the time they have left. And so, with that in mind, let's just say that I was headed to a little town with the pseudonym of Ashby, and way out in the hollers of Appalachian, Virginia. And for those who don't know what a holler is, it's basically like small valleys which carve up Appalachia's rolling hills, and one of the best words I can use to describe them is arterial. In a 5-mile radius, they might be 15 to 20 of them, all hidden away around the highways on which small towns spring up, with Ashby being one of them. And by the time I got there, coal was the basis of the town's economy, and with the oil crisis plaguing the mid-70s, as you might remember, the town's business was booming. Folks were moving themselves into Ashby by the dozen after getting themselves jobs in the mines. And although the town's 2 churches were enough to cater to the new arrivals, there was no Sunday school teacher to teach the ever-rising number of kids. And that, boys and girls, is where I came in. After renting a small single bedroom in a local boarding house, I set about introducing myself to the local preachers. And then once I had their blessing, I cobbled together a small tent, some chairs, and a chalkboard. I'd once believed that growing a full and attentive classroom would take patience, but from that very first Sunday, my tent was just about full to bursting. I taught the kids all about Jonah and the whale, they always loved that one, and how God can help us out even when all seems lost. And then when it came to feedback from parents, the only complaint seemed to be that there weren't enough chairs. But the next Sunday, almost every set of parents brought some piece of lawn furniture or an old folding chair, just about anything they could get their hands on. And over time, the Virginia chapter of the Schoolhouse Project proved a resounding success. Ashby might
I
have
don't
been a
know if
poor
I want
community,
to get
but people were
rid
rich
of
in
this
spirit,
slime.
and through meeting the parents of children I taught, I became familiar with almost everyone in town. Some parents genuinely wanted their children to be taught scripture. Others simply wanted someone to watch them for an hour while they fought through their hangovers. And I came to suspect the mother of a boy named Joshua fell firmly into that second camp. She didn't seem very interested in talking to me when she came to collect him on Sunday mornings. She just appreciated me being there to watch him. And so when little Joshua didn't show up to Sunday school for 2 weeks running, I became a little worried. I called over to his mom's place, a little trailer on the edge of town, and was relieved to hear that Joshua had just been under the weather. But when I next saw him at Sunday school, he still looked very pale, and he seemed much more timid than usual. After giving the kids some paper and crayons and asking them to draw an animal that they think would have been on Noah's Ark, I took Joshua to one side and asked him how he was. He must have been no more than 7 or 8 years old, and he wasn't the most confident of children. But when he told me that he'd been sick and had to stay home, he couldn't look me in the eyes at all. When I asked him what kind of illness he'd been suffering from, Joshua said that he didn't know. He just knew that it made him want to sleep a whole bunch until he suddenly felt better again. That all sounded pretty regular to me, so I didn't press him on it. But before he went back to his seat, Joshua told me about a dream that he had when he was sick. He said that the first time he fell asleep after getting so sick he couldn't stand up anymore, he dreamed that he was walking through a patch of underpants trees. Hearing the words underpants trees in sequence took me so off guard that at first I sort of laughed a little bit. Joshua smiled too as I confirmed what he'd said, and then he told me how these big old make-do dolls come out from behind the trunks of the underpants trees and started to play with him. Now, for those that don't know, a make-do doll is a sort of Appalachian tradition, or at least something that became one over time. The concept was brought over by English and Scottish immigrants in the 1800s and refers to a doll that's cobbled together from old scraps of things, one you make do with. They come in all shapes and sizes, but a lot of make-do dolls are simply cloth sacks that have been stuffed and had faces stitched on them.
Make do doll. That's pretty fucking funny.
Came out of the trees, I pictured a bunch of silly-looking sack men with scraps of hair and silly hats, with big old smiles stitched onto their fronts. Joshua said if he had dreams like that every time he got sick, then getting sick wouldn't be so bad. The only thing was, after he had it, he felt worse than ever, and he slept for the longest time before he finally started to feel better again. It's hard to even say this now, but at the time I just sort of laughed. I told Josh that it was the silliest dream I'd ever heard of, and he must have had one heck of an imagination to dream something like that up. He smiled again, and then, before he returned to his seat, he said something which made my heart sink. He said the next time he got so sick he fell down, he hoped that he wouldn't have to sleep out in the woods again. Now, looking back, I'm not sure how I got through the remainder of that lesson, but somehow I sort of powered through it, and usually it was Josh that struggled to look at me in the eye, but when his mom came to get him, it was me that had trouble looking at her. What Josh told me stayed on my mind for the rest of that Sunday, and then the next morning, I used the phone at the boarding house to call the county sheriff's office. A few hours later, a young deputy that I'll just call Isaac arrived at the boarding house, and when I laid out everything Joshua had told me, Deputy Isaac said that he'd make sure little Joshua was being taken care of, but he also warned me that in Appalachia, taken care of was a relative term. Folks had to work so hard and so long just to keep food on the table that even the good ones didn't have the time to watch their kids 24/7. Then if the department went around filing neglect cases on everyone who let their kids run off into the hollers, half the county would be up on charges. Isaac could head over to Josh's place, talk to his parents, even give them a warning, but they weren't going to transform overnight, at least not while their grocery run looked like it came from a distillery. And I knew I couldn't help people who didn't want to change. But I also knew that having the law breathing down their necks might prompt Josh's mom to change their ways, so I was appreciative nonetheless. Isaac called me back a few days later saying the situation likely wasn't as bad as I thought. Joshua had collapsed in the woods all right, but his mom went and found him after sundown following a frantic search, at which point she took him home and nursed him back to health. And as you can imagine, this was music to my ears. I didn't want to cause his parents any trouble. I just wanted to make sure little Josh was okay. And then since there were no more repeat absences and no more strange dreams, I believed that that was the end of my concerns. Another 6 weeks went by without event, and the only sadness I felt was knowing that one day I'd have to pack up and return to Maine. Some might call the place very boring, but to me, the town had such a peaceful simplicity about it. Very little happened in Ashby, and so when something did happen, it was the talk of the town. I remember calling into the grocery store one day, saying hi to Chet behind the counter, and then immediately being hit with, "Hey, Pastor, did you hear about the fire over in Godby Holler?"
What?
It turned out that, just as Chet said, there had been a fire in a place called Godby Holler, which, coincidentally, was host to an old abandoned plague town that folks believed was haunted. Still a relative newcomer, I'd never heard of the place when he first mentioned it, but Chet soon filled me in on his history and how if it wasn't for the town of Godby suffering an outbreak of plague just after the Civil War, Ashby might not exist at all. He said scores of poor folks had their homes nailed shut out there, and while an effort was made later to burn the place down, some of the quarantined homes still stood. The holler was way overgrown, meaning you had to be a fool to head in there if you didn't want snake bit. But Chet also told me that even if it wasn't, folks would still avoid Godby Holler like the plague on account of it being haunted. Chet said that he'd already heard rumors that the fire was of spectral origins, that the restless ghosts of the plague victims were trying to finish the job of purifying the place. But in both Chet's and my own humble opinions, the cause was more likely to be a cigarette butt, freshly flicked from some teenager's fingers. The fire had raged all night, then been extinguished by fire crews shortly after dawn, and generally speaking, the townsfolk treated the fire as an isolated anomaly, but in truth, it was the first in a chain of events that, by then, could never be stopped. Around 6 weeks prior to my return to Maine, 3 of Ashby's residents disappeared overnight. One of the men owned a small trucking business, so we'll just call him the trucker. and another was a supervisor at one of the county's few functioning sawmills, so we'll just call him the logger. And both were respectable members of Ashby's community and, from what I can gather, had no prior dealings with the law. But the same could not be said for the third man. And for reasons that'll become obvious, I'll simply refer to this man as the brother. But for now, all you need to know is that the brother was a deadbeat alcoholic who lived in a poorly kept trailer in the same park as little Joshua and his mom. Unlike the other two missing men, the brother was most certainly known to the police, and in addition to his long list of priors, he was a constant thorn in the side of Ashby's citizens. He'd drink, he'd steal, he'd start fights, and in what I considered a delicious twist of irony, was the brother of none other than Deputy Isaac. Learning this sparked a deep sympathy in me. Isaac's brother, ever the black sheep of the family, had finally fallen victim to his own poor choices and had no doubt ended up in some serious trouble. It certainly didn't seem to be some innocent and spontaneous vacation, as the three men barely knew each other. Neither had they left any kind of note, so given the brothers' history, it was assumed their disappearances were of a criminal nature. Some feared the brother had murdered the two men following some kind of altercation and had left after hiding their bodies somewhere. Others suggested a mutually beneficial plot had gone bad. For example, maybe a drug deal had gone wrong. Needless to say, the men did not return, and as time went by, Ashby's residents grew more and more despondent. They launched public appeals, made missing posters, and walked the woods surrounding the town while calling out the missing men's names. Then as the posters and the search parties started to dwindle, so did their hope, and that's when the vigil started. Folks would walk the streets looking somber and holding candles, all silently praying for the missing men's return. I joined every single one, although it filled me with anguish, especially to see Deputy Isaac among the crowd, with a terrible look of grief in his eyes. At the time, I believed his experience as a police officer was robbing him of hope, how he must have seen too many bodies at too many crime scenes to believe the men had taken an impromptu fishing trip or were laying low after a deal went wrong. I approached him and asked if he wanted to talk, but he declined my invitation. Now, maybe a week or so after the final vigil, a hope tree was erected inside one of Ashby's churches. Now, it was little more than a sheet of cardboard, cut out in the shape of a tree which had pictures of the three missing men attached to it. But joining them were flowers, candles around the bottom, and notes that folks had written expressing hope for their return. It was shaped like a pine tree, simple but beautiful, much like the metaphor the church's preacher used when he said their hope, like God's love, was evergreen. But then one night, somebody slipped into the church under the cover of darkness and trashed that beautiful hope tree in a very violent manner, and the town was shocked to its very core. Ashby was a place where things like that just didn't happen. People respected their neighbors just fine, but that wasn't anything compared to their respect for the sanctity of the church. So to have someone doing something so violent to something that meant so much to folks, people were outraged. They demanded the county sheriff track down the person that did it, and potential witnesses were urged to come forward. People were tense, very tense, and it broke my heart to see those usually peaceful, loving people suddenly turn on each other like they did. Folks who weren't on the best of terms with the missing suffered thinly veiled accusations, and one town meeting descended into a yelling contest before it was concluded. Now, I suppose it was the thought of how close they were to catching the culprit that got people so excited, because in the commission of the crime, the perpetrator had left something behind. It was a mask, a full head cover made of sackcloth, and stitched onto the outside was a smiley face.
Gross.
Everyone in Ashby knew it was a case of find whoever owned the mask and you had your perp. But the sheriff never did locate its owner. But it wasn't the mask owner who left it at the scene. It was someone else. I just didn't find out who until the night before I drove back to Maine, when the boarding house I was staying at received a call which was intended for me. It was Deputy Isaac calling, but he didn't sound his usual self as he asked if I was free to talk. When I told him he was welcome to stop by at the boarding house, he told me it was a conversation best conducted in private, and this is why we arranged to meet in darkness a few miles down the road, not far from the entrance to the
It was the
burned-out
deputy that did
holler.
it.
Now, I rather naively believed that I was in for yet another emotional goodbye. A great many of Ashby's residents had been saddened by my imminent departure, and many a tear had been shed, and so I believed the Macho Man Deputy Isaac didn't want his tears visible to the public. And in a sense, I was correct. They were tears, and there was a goodbye, but Deputy Isaac also had a story for me, one that so shook me so deeply that I still think about it, sometimes daily, even after all these years. And it was after dark when I drove over to the proposed meeting spot, and then after parking my car, I got out and waited patiently for Isaac's arrival. He walked out of the darkness not long after, alone, and with a bottle of liquor in his hand. And I could tell that he was sauced just from the way he was walking, and it was then that I got the impression that it wasn't going to be the emotional goodbye that I believed it to be. In fact, by the looks of him, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't a little scared of Deputy Isaac that night, right then. After exchanging a few awkward pleasantries, I asked Isaac what he wanted to talk to me about. He didn't reply right away, and instead he took a long drink from the bottle of his hand while he appeared to gather his thoughts. And when Isaac asked if he could make a confession to me as a pastor, I told him things didn't exactly work like that in the Presbyterian Church. If he wanted to make a confession, he could do so directly to God, because while God sees and knows all, he certainly appreciates a little personal honesty from his children. Isaac said something about how a one-on-one with God wouldn't cut it. Not at that current moment, anyway. And instead, he wanted to jawbone with someone man to man, not man to God. And I understood, so I asked what he wanted to confess. But before he spoke, Isaac said the only reason that he was talking to me was that I was leaving for Maine in the morning. He asked if I was ever going to come back someday, and when I replied, yes, hopefully, he told me to push that idea right out of my mind. He was about to tell me something that no one could ever know, not anyone who lived around Ashby anyway. And so once he told me, I was to stay away, and for good, too. And if I didn't promise as such, then he wouldn't say another word. And I figured that since Isaac obviously wanted so badly to share what was on his mind, the dutiful thing to do was honor his wishes and swear myself to at least partial silence. Now, once he'd secured my promise, Isaac told me that a few days before the fire in Godby Holler, he bumped into an old coworker while in the next county over. This old coworker of Isaac's now worked for the Russell County Sheriffs, and when Isaac asked him how things were going, his old coworker shared details of a recent investigation with him. The week prior, Isaac's old coworker arrested a teenage prostitute for solicitation, and then while in the back of his car, the girl started talking about a recent assault that she'd been subjected to. Now at first, the old partner thought that she was just making it up to buy herself some sympathy, along with some time out of her cell with a cup of coffee and a cigarette. But once she got going, the old
Excuse me.
her story was for real. The girl said a John picked her up for a date and then drove her someplace before parking his truck and offering her a beer. The girl said she took it, and then they drank together as they talked terms, so to speak. And that was pretty much the last thing she remembered until she woke up in the woods, all black and blue and feeling sore as hell. She wasn't sure what she'd been drugged with. She just knew that it must have been some pretty potent stuff, because all she remembered was being taken to a haunted house by a masked man, and how when they were dragging her out again, the leaves on the trees turned into underpants right before her eyes.
Oh no.
Isaac's old coworker wanted to know what kind of drug might cause hallucinations, unconsciousness, and memory loss, and Isaac replied that there was a bunch of stuff that induced such effects, one of which was called roofies, or Rohypnol these days. But as he talked, his mind had long since started to wander. On his drive back toward Ashby, Isaac couldn't take his mind off what his old coworker had said about the leaves turning into underpants. He'd heard that same thing somewhere before, and recently too, and then finally it clicked. He remembered how little Joshua had mentioned underpants trees to me at Sunday school, and it was a minor detail I'd mentioned in passing, but as I'm sure you'll agree, the image stuck. Isaac considered how unlikely it was that two people who'd apparently no connection whatsoever had dreamed up the exact same imagery just months apart. He then thought about the girl being taken to a haunted house. There was only one place near Ashby he knew to be haunted, quote-unquote, and that place was Godby Holler, home of the old, half-scorched plague town that nobody ever dared visit. With all those thoughts running around his mind, Deputy Isaac decided to stop by Godby Holler on his way back to Ashby. It had been untouched for more than 100 years by that point, meaning anything short of a tank would have trouble driving through without getting stuck. And so Isaac hopped out of his truck and then went wandering into the haunted Godby Holler after dark, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a pistol. He walked and walked, feeling his leg getting cut to ribbons by thorny olives and Jimson weed pods, and while he found the half-burned plague town of Godby with no problem, he didn't find any underpants trees. Isaac carried on walking, looping back around to cover the whole holler. Then on his way back, tucked into a shady corner, he found a clearing ringed by unusually colored dogwood trees. Because it wasn't just white dogwood flowers decorating those trees, and when Isaac shone his flashlight into them, he saw dozens of pairs of differently colored underwear, all hanging from branches. Deputy Isaac said that he put it all together on the spot. If the assault of that teenage girl was for real, and she hadn't simply hallucinated the underpants tree or the men in the sackcloth masks who looked like make-do dolls, then neither had little Joshua. Now, what made it all worse was that all those pairs of underpants dangling from the branches looked like trophies. And if that was the case, then the number of victims had to be in the high double figures. How long had these monsters been active in taking their victims to Godby Holler? Who were they? And how had it taken until then for it all to come to light? These were all things Deputy Isaac pondered to himself as he walked back to his truck to grab the spare can of gasoline that he kept in the back of his truck. And he knew it wasn't a good idea to burn evidence like that, and that by doing so, he was potentially jeopardizing the prosecution's case should it get to a court of law. But Isaac didn't care. He wanted the men behind those sackcloth masks to know their crimes had been uncovered, because once the cat was out of the bag, all he had to do was sit back and watch whose dogs started barking. Isaac soaked those dogwood trees in gasoline, set them on fire, and watched them burn for a while before heading back into Ashby. And then the next morning, the fire was the talk of the town. Isaac played his part as the oblivious deputy, but took the opportunity to gauge folks' reactions when he asked them, "Did you hear about the fire up in Godby Holler?" Everyone he asked replied with innocent surprise, everyone except his deadbeat brother, who mysteriously had a bus to catch not long after hearing the news. Deputy Isaac found that incredibly coincidental, so he drove over to his brother's trailer to take a look around. And it was there, hidden away in the back of a messy closet, that Isaac found a bag containing a sackcloth mask with a smiley face stitched onto the front. Isaac's brother returned home later that night to a dark and seemingly empty trailer. But waiting for him in that closet, which contained the sackcloth mask, was his sheriff's deputy brother. Isaac said he had to torture him to get the full story, because not the law and not even a gun to his head scared him enough to reveal the truth. Isaac had to stuff his brother's mouth with a wet rag while he beat him, and then after he broke the first finger, his brother started to talk. He, the logger, and the trucker had been picking out victims for almost a decade by that point. They didn't do it often, just whenever the brother needed money so bad that he was willing to lure a child into the woods to drink a special bottle of sody pop that he'd laced with downers. Only the brother got so used to dosing kids that he messed up supremely when it came to drugging that teenage prostitute. And that was his one big mistake, and by pure happenstance, it made its way back to him in a way that he could never have predicted. Having learned that his brother, his own flesh and blood, was practically the linchpin in a local predator ring, Isaac had some serious thinking to do. He ended up untying his brother from the chair that he'd bound him to, and then, after popping the caps off a couple of beers, Isaac said he'd fix everything. All his brother needed to do was call up his two buddies and arrange a meeting so Isaac could figure out which creases needed to be smoothed out. He said his brother was so grateful that he cried, and in the service of covering up his crimes, was only too willing to set up that meeting. But once he did, and he relayed the time and location, Isaac grabbed his brother by the throat and strangled him to death right there in his trailer. Later that night, he drove out to the meeting place and waited for the trucker and logger, and then when they'd showed up, all that waited for them was judgment.
What's this?
Deputy Isaac said that he threw the two men's bodies in the trunk along with his brothers, and then he drove to an old abandoned mine that he knew of a few counties over and tossed their bodies down a very derelict shaft. Isaac said at first he had no doubt that he'd done the right thing. He said the legal system in this country is kind of like a sieve, and since some crimes slip through the cracks, he couldn't bear to sit back and let that happen after a full-blown confession from one of the perps. He didn't regret killing the logger or the trucker, but the memory of that look in his brother's eyes, the one he got when he realized his own brother was going to end him, it haunted Deputy Isaac. He remembered the story of Cain and Abel, and albeit in very different circumstances, began asking himself the same thing Cain did, that question being, am I my brother's keeper? He began wondering if he should have helped his brother, not by covering up his crimes, but by putting him in handcuffs and protecting him from himself. And that's when Deputy Isaac asked me, in my most humble opinion, if I believed a man who'd murdered his own brother would be allowed to enter heaven. I told him he'd have to make a very good case before the Lord because the oldest of the oldest laws still read, "Thou shalt not kill." But I also said that if what he told me was the God's honest truth, then certain provisions might be made for a man who'd killed to protect the innocent from, and I say this with no hyperbole whatsoever, the power of Satan. Isaac told me that the only reason he was sharing all this with me, and me alone, was that the people of Ashby were simply not able to handle the truth. And aside from his brother, the missing men had both been pillars of their community, and if the truth was known, it would tear the fabric of that community apart. The same effect would be achieved if the whole thing went to trial and the truth came out that way, and so instead, Deputy Isaac decided to dispense justice both personally and privately. The only real question that remained was whether or not he could live with the memory of killing his own flesh and blood. I still think of Deputy Isaac and his brother even all this time later, because there's a line from the Book of Chronicles I wish I'd shared with him that night that we met near Godby Holler. If my people, who are called by my name, humble themselves and pray, and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. But there's also a verse from Ezekiel that I wish I'd shared with him too, one which reads, "So I will tear down the wall which you plastered over with whitewash, and bring it down to the ground, so that its foundations is laid bare. And when it falls, you will be consumed in its midst, and you will know that I am the Lord." It's a verse all about the consequences of concealing evil deeds, and how when men lay them bare and allow the wicked to be consumed by their own misdeeds, they become the instruments of God. Because in this life, or the next, there will be consequences for those who inflict wickedness, especially upon the innocent, and I believe that enough to bet my mortal soul on it. So peace be upon you, Deputy Isaac. You know who you are, and you're still in my prayers.
And that is a good way to end. That was a good ass fucking story. Yeah, that was a good ass story. Okay. It's just I'm not trying to stay up too late. All right. Thank you for watching my stream. You guys have a rest of a good day or night. Yeah, still trying to work on this piece. It's just the scratchy parts I don't know how I'm gonna do, but yeah. Um, but yeah, you guys have a good work week. Ugh, I feel like the weekend just started. Ugh. Gotta go back. I gotta go back. Ah. All right. You guys stay safe, stay healthy, stay